Good morning to those on the East Coast in the United States. Good afternoon to those in Europe and especially in Ukraine. And my name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you today, a very timely event. Will Putin go nuclear over Ukraine is the way we modestly put it. And we have a first-rate panel of people to discuss this for you. We have Debra Cagan, who's a Distinguished Energy Fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. We have General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. We have Matt Kroening, the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and the Director of the Center's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative. We have Jan Lodal, a Distinguished Fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And we have Christopher Preble, the Co-Director of the New American Engagement Initiative in the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. So that's our lineup, and we'll start with questions right away from me, and then we will turn to audience questions after about 35 or 40 minutes. So Wes, we'll start with you. The nuclear issue has arisen in part because Putin's conventional war in Ukraine is not going well. What is the situation on the ground?
Situation is Russian forces have not made the progress that Mr. Putin expected. They're having logistics problems, communication and coordinations problems, but they still have the preponderance of force if they can bring it to bear on the battle. They are maneuvering in the south. They are getting some breakthroughs, and Kiev is in danger of encirclement and besiege. So where it stands is it's a balanced on the knife edge for the next few days as to whether the encirclement can be prevented and Kiev can be given the necessary missiles and other hardware to resist a Russian assault, or whether that assault's going to close in on Kiev and make it impossible to provide assistance. If it's stalled, Putin has his nuclear and chemical forces ready to be used. He could use them. If NATO decides to intervene forcefully, they could be used against NATO. It's all about Vladimir Putin's mind, plus the ability and ingenuity of the West and Ukrainians to get the necessary military assistance in to defeat the Russian force on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Matt, during the Cold War, Moscow enjoyed conventional superiority in Europe. Today, NATO enjoys that superiority. Moscow has developed a military doctrine for first use of nuclear weapons, which we call escalate to de-escalate. Could you please explain what this doctrine means and how it might relate to this crisis?
Yes, thanks, Ambassador Herbst, and thanks for having me here today. So the escalate to de-escalate strategy is basically backstopping conventional aggression with nuclear threats. So we saw this in 2014 when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and Crimea. At that time, Putin made nuclear threats. He said, Russia is a major nuclear power. It's best not to mess with us. He didn't put nuclear weapons on high alert, but he later bragged that he thought about it. And so we're seeing him replay that playbook here, invading Ukraine, and then very early in the crisis, making nuclear threats, putting nuclear weapons on high alert in this case. And so I think the message is very clear to NATO and the United States. Essentially stay out or else things could escalate to the nuclear level. And I agree with General Clark. While I think at this stage of the crisis, these are threats meant to cast a nuclear shadow over the crisis, to make the West act more cautiously, I do think there are scenarios where I could imagine Putin using nuclear weapons in this crisis to avoid an embarrassing defeat, for example.
All right. Jan, you've been involved in American foreign policy for many decades, including the development of US nuclear capacity and doctrine. How does our nuclear posture position us to deal with this crisis? And how, in your view, should we respond to Putin's raising the nuclear alert level of Russian forces?
Well, thank you, John. I think the first thing that we all have to understand and accept is that nuclear deterrence, which has worked throughout the nuclear age, continues to be effective despite this war. And what we need to do is reinforce the strength of our deterrent posture. That should be our main focus. So what does that mean? Perhaps our senior military or even the president himself should make some statements to that effect. that to remind Putin that our nuclear deterrent force is capable of responding proportionately to anything that Russia does. We don't have to launch a catastrophic response to a small Russian attack. We have the capability to do whatever is appropriate to make it clear that this is unacceptable. And that should deter any attack if we do that. The other thing we have to do is continue to emphasize that Russia will never be able to advance its war aims by using a nuclear strike. And our support of Ukraine cannot be effective by any of this nuclear saber rattling. That has to be the primary response to their nuclear threats. Finally, that any Russian nuclear weapons used directly against us would risk the annihilation of all of Russia, and therefore there's nothing to be gained by it. And our promise of no direct NATO involvement in Ukraine would no longer apply at all if, in fact, nuclear weapons were used against Russia. So I think there are a few things we could do. We could do some unannounced exercises of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, which are closest to Ukraine, which presumably is what he's threatening. We could reposition our SSBNs, our submarines, to focus our capability. We now have the capability on these submarines to launch limited nuclear responses. They can probably do it from where they are, but that might send a message to reposition them, although normally we don't allow anyone to know where they are. We should not increase our defense condition, our DEFCON, which is what we do when we think there really might be a big nuclear outbreak. That would be unnecessarily provocative and unnecessary to give us the strong deterrent we need to maintain.
Jan, thank you for those concrete ideas. Let me ask a quick follow-up question. So you're suggesting, for example, a tactical nuclear exercise would be less provocative than changing our DEFCON status. Is that right? And explain more for those who are not experts in this.
Yes, exactly. And by exercise, I'm not talking about a large movement of some kind. I'm just talking about something that would be visible that would show that we're paying attention to those forces that are near the battlefield there and that they remain ready. All
right. Thank you. Okay, Chris. Many pundits argue that we must be careful in the aid we give Ukraine to avoid precisely a NATO-Russia confrontation with the danger of a nuclear exchange. How real is this danger?
Well, John, thanks again for the invitation to participate. It's an honor to be here. I think that you framed this question very well. Is will Putin go nuclear? And I don't think anyone on this panel can say with confidence that that they know the answer. We just don't know. It's a question. And in the past, when the United States and previously the Soviet Union and some incidents since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when we confronted these situations of the possibility of US or NATO forces coming into direct contact with Soviet or Russian forces, the worry of escalation was always there, even at a time when, I'm just a humble historian. So most of my, deep knowledge comes from the 50s and 60s. Even someone like Dwight Eisenhower didn't contemplate the use of nuclear weapons to punish the Soviet Red Army in Hungary in 56, or threaten the use of nuclear weapons in Berlin in 61 or 62, and John Kennedy. So, there are many other incidents where the United States and separately the Soviet Union or the Russians have withheld the use of nuclear weapons, even though they have the ability to use them, decades now. And again, I think many people look back and say that it's only by good luck that no nuclear weapons have been used in anger since 1945. Will our luck run out? We don't know. So I think it's important to have this discussion and to think seriously about the dangers. The danger of escalation is real. I think President Biden has been very wise in communicating clearly what the United States is willing to do and what the United States is not willing to do. He has the strong support of U.S. allies and partners. Not 1 inch of NATO territory, but no U.S. forces and no NATO forces in Ukraine. That seems to be the right approach. One last thing I'll say is that that while we say, I think Matt said a few minutes ago that the threat from Putin was, stay out or else. Well, the United States and many other countries around the world are imposing extraordinary costs on the Russian people mostly, and the Russian economy in general. The Russian stock market has been closed now. It's now in its third week. The ruble has collapsed. And Vladimir Putin has already said these economic measures are the equivalent of war and may be imposing costs far higher on those Russians that are being suffered in this war. So I think we need to be clear that what the United States and what the rest of the world is doing to the Russians right now is not mostly military in nature. What the Ukrainians are doing to fight against the Russians is, but the pain that is being imposed on the on Russia because of Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine is felt far more widely, and I think arguably is far more effective even than talk of additional provision of military assistance, which is so I want to make sure that we include that as part of our discussion today.
Okay, thank you. Debra, some critics of the administration say that it has not done enough to support Ukraine because it is unduly concerned about provoking an aggressive Kremlin. They point to the recent decision not to send MiGs to Ukraine. Russia has threatened to attack weapons shipments from the West to Ukraine, and to underscore that it bombed the training base at Yavoriv, miles from the Polish border. Is the US and NATO being deterred from providing the aid Ukraine needs by Putin's nuclear brinksmanship?
John, thank you for the opportunity to be here today with such an august crowd. And not surprisingly, I'm going to take a different tact. I would argue that Putin doesn't have to do much more than threaten, and that's enough to make the West quiver. So I would argue that just by raising that nuclear prospect, there are legions of people now who are ready to throw out, as Jan put it, decades of deterrence orthodoxy and say, oh my God, we can't do anything else because Russia's going to launch something or it's going to move weapons to Belarus. And so I would argue that Putin's already accomplished one of his key goals, which is to stop the United States and other countries from upping quantitatively the type of weapon systems they're providing to Ukraine. And I think that is he fully expected a Chicken Little the sky is falling moment to happen, and it's occurred. And I think the only Chicken Little moment here is that the sky's only going to fall if we let it. And I would argue that this administration needs to take what I call a much stronger leadership position, stop following, start leading, and understand that Putin is spewing a lot of this invective in the hopes that it's going to accomplish exactly what he aimed for, which is to just scare the West into not doing more to protect Ukraine. And I think that is just a strategic blunder.
All right, let me follow up on that a little bit. You said that people have seemed to have thrown aside in their concern about a possible Russian strike decades of deterrence doctrine and practice. Would you describe that a little bit more?
Well, in the late 40s, Stalin had this expression where he was asked if he would ever attack the United States. And I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the quotes in front of me. But he said, no, democracies are crazy. You can't trust them. And then sort of referring to Harry Truman, it's like he didn't use just one nuclear weapon. He's so crazy that he used two to end the war in the Pacific. And I think that was probably the largest deterrent the world had ever seen. And I would argue that at this juncture that when Putin said we might move weapons into Belarus, everyone got very upset, but they forgot that Russia has had non-strategic weapons, as Jan knows well, in Kaliningrad on the borders with Poland and Lithuania for decades. The Iskander, and before that, the SS-21s and the SS-23s. So these have been out there for some time. He plays nuclear poker with Lithuania and Poland all the time there, talking about the type of warheads he's putting on those systems. And I think that we are now sort of saying, oh my God, Belarus. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. they've been sitting here all along. Why are we now going into high dudgeon?
All right, thank you. All right, Wes.
I want to follow on what Debra said.
Okay,
First,
please.
First, I agree with what Debra said. Secondly, I want to take this discussion and suggest, John, we have to ask the question slightly differently.
Please.
Here's the question. We start with the assumption that Vladimir Putin is going to use nuclear weapons. He is. He's either going to use it against us if we help Ukraine, or he's going to use it in Ukraine if we help Ukraine defend and defeat the Russian forces. He is going to use it. He wants to use a nuclear weapon. This gives him power not only over Ukraine, but over his subsequent efforts in the Baltics and against other countries in Eastern Europe. So what's the best, if you assume he wants to use these forces, then what's the best response that we should take? Okay, my suggestion is we have to sort of digest this. We have to assume these forces, this nuclear weapon is going to be used. Now, there's an alternative. You could simply tell Zelensky, look, we don't care about Ukraine. We don't care about your nation. We just want to surrender. Please, please, please don't use a nuclear weapon. It would be so terrible. We're not saying that. So if we're not saying that, then start with the assumption he will use a nuclear weapon and ask, what's the right course of action to deal with this? Because that's Putin's predisposition. Now, what I would suggest is that what's happened is we keep pushing this problem downrange. So we're below the curve of which we have to be on to have Ukraine defeat the Russian forces on the ground. That's where we want to be. We don't want to be in the position that a week from now, President Biden goes to the Europeans and said, you know, we can't afford to let Ukraine fall. I'm going to authorize a no-fly zone. Why did we get to that point? At every stage, we've been reactive. We have to think through this and be proactive. We could have had a no-fly zone when the Russians were denying they weren't going to invade. We could have had a humanitarian corridor when the invasion first started. We could have gone to the United Nations 2 days ago and said, safe area around Mariupol. We haven't done this. If we've done it, it hasn't been publicized. We're behind. So on the nuclear piece, as Debra said, Putin's already accomplished it. He's got everybody frightened. Okay, so you've got to take that in and say, assume he's going to do it. Now, what is the best thing for NATO? It's better to defend NATO in Ukraine than it is in the Baltics or Poland. Just face it, it's better. And we're not going to be any stronger 6 months or a year from now to deal with cyber, satellites, or a nuclear threat in Europe. We've got to come to terms with where we are. It's a major inflection point in world history that Putin has forced us to face.
Okay, but Wes, I just want to clarify, because you may have just given the headline from this event. Are you saying that you believe that Putin, in fact, is going to use nuclear weapons? Or you're simply saying we should be prepared for that possibility and not let that deter us in defending our interests?
I think we have to start from the presumption that he would welcome the opportunity to use nuclear weapons. He wants to show his determination. He wants to intimidate the West. So I'm not saying that it's 100% that he will use them. I'm saying you start your analysis by the presumption that he thinks he has a nuclear advantage. You saw the quote about Donald Trump. He says, Donald, we've got these hypersonics. And Donald said, oh yeah, we'll get them too. He said, you don't understand. We've got them now. You'll get them eventually. I mean, as Jan said, a deterrent is a deterrent. Putin maybe not understands it. We understand it, but there's no magic about a NATO red line. The Baltics can't be defended as easily as Ukraine can.
There's no doubt about that. I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll move on to the others. So your principal argument here, I'm asking, I'm not saying, is that if we let Putin's nuclear brinksmanship prevent us from helping Ukraine defend itself, we will face the same challenge on less favorable grounds in the Baltic states. Is that your point?
That is exactly my point. And on Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. All right, good. Jan, I think Wes just opened the Pandora's box here, so why don't we deal with the contents that are flying out? Your response to and analysis of the things that Wes just said.
Well, I really think we're pretty much together. We're pretty much together on this, because I suggested some specific moves to make it clear that we are not afraid of responding with a nuclear weapon if he starts it. And I think that's the way to communicate it, not with just some words and whatever. And I don't think we've done that. That's why I suggested some movements with our forces in Europe, which would look like we're getting ready and we're strengthening and doing that. Some movements with our submarine forces, some other things. These things would all communicate by action, not just words, that, we have said our policy has been that we will respond to any nuclear attack with a response that would be much worse than what anybody would have gotten out of, or that would offset any benefit they would get. And that's what makes our deterrent work. So we just have to do all of that to increase our deterrent. I suspect that West doesn't really want us to have to use nuclear weapons, but we both want to deter Putin from using a nuclear weapon. And regardless, I think there's some probability he will too. West thinks there's a probability. We could argue a lot about whether our probabilities are exactly the same. The fact of the matter is that we have to proceed and assume that it's a very real possibility, and we must make our preparations in that context. Now, I will say that there's a lot of interesting things about history, and Christopher said some things there, and it'd be fun to have a discussion about that. I've been reading more stuff about the Berlin crisis and the approval that Kennedy gave for a nuclear response, a nuclear preemptive response there, actually. But the situation was radically different then, and we had a very strong superiority. And I think for the last several decades, there has been a mutual deterrent situation. And we just have to make sure that mutual deterrent situation is in fact fully mutual, and that they understand what would happen to them also, so that we can proceed and provide all the support that we have to do. I think all of us are saying that this is a tied together situation. We've got to give the Ukrainians the support. We should have given them sooner, but we got to do it now. Every day that goes by and that we don't give them better anti-air capability, we don't give them these better things, the higher, the greater the risk that it might come to his nuclear use or whatever when we try to do it later on.
Okay, Jan, thank you. I'm going to follow up because Wes's comments moved us straight to nuclear, because there's been a lot of talk in the press about possible Russian use of chemical weapons. Do you see that as different, less ominous than the nuclear option?
Are you asking me to start?
Yes, please.
Well, of course, it's less ominous, and it would be less effective for them. They wouldn't get much out of it. Certainly, our military can defend themselves against chemical attacks and so forth. Now, our military isn't there directly, but if we had to get involved, we could defend ourselves against chemical attacks. So it's a different situation. And I don't know, we could talk a lot about how you deal with chemical threats, but that would probably take us down a long path, and I'm not sure is terribly relevant here.
Okay, thank you. All right, Matt, my apologies for having jumped to Jan. I should have put that to you, but I ask you to comment on what's been said right now, both especially on the nuclear side, but also if you have any comments on possible use by the Kremlin of chemical weapons.
Yeah, thanks. So first, in response to what General Clark said, I think he's right. These nuclear threats are meant to frighten us, meant to get us to back down, to curtail our support. But I think we often forget that this risk is two-sided. It shouldn't only be the West that's worried about nuclear escalation. Putin should be worried about escalation as well. The United States is a major nuclear superpower. Putin doesn't want a nuclear war with us. And so I think there is quite a bit of room for us to dial up our support to the Ukrainians without this resulting in a nuclear exchange. The second thing that I would say, this is more of a prediction than a recommendation, but the Biden administration has been very clear that they're not going to get involved militarily in Ukraine. And so I do think that there's a possibility that if Putin did use nuclear weapons, that the Biden administration's response would be to just fight through it, keep doing what we're doing, support the Ukrainians, maybe tougher sanctions, maybe a UN Security Council meeting. But the Biden administration, one option would be to back down. Oh my God, they've used a nuclear weapon. Let's sue for peace. Another one would be, as Jan's recommending, let's retaliate with nuclear weapons. A third would be to just say, let's just keep doing what we're doing and not let the Russians' use of nuclear weapons phase us.
All right, thank you. Chris, I'd like to have your views on this because I'm sure they're quite different, and give us a different perspective, please.
Well, I mean, I think that with respect to your question about chemical and biological weapons, the United States has reserved for itself the right to use nuclear weapons in response to chemical and biological attacks. That was part of the change in U.S. stated nuclear doctrine. And of course, the United States has never had a no first use policy. So the United States has retains the right, or at least has stated its willingness to use nuclear weapons first, not just in response to the use of nuclear weapons. So I guess I am struck by the question. General Clark says that Vladimir Putin wants to use nuclear weapons. I presume he means he doesn't want a nuclear war because and this would presume, sort of following on what Matt just said, that using nuclear weapons that did not lead to a general nuclear war would mean that the United States and the West and NATO back down after the first use of nuclear weapons by Russian forces. I don't think he can assume that. I don't think he should be operating under that assumption. I see his likelihood to use nuclear weapons far more related, not so much to conditions on the ground in Ukraine even, but on conditions on the ground back in Russia. If he sees that his only option is death one way or the other, will that increase his incentive to use nuclear weapons and then not be deterred? Because I think we're all in agreement that for the most part there has been a mutual state of deterrence for some time. Will he be more inclined to use nuclear weapons when he is facing not just catastrophic defeat in Ukraine, which is a possibility, but the collapse of his government back in Russia?
Okay, so Chris, just to confirm, you're suggesting that if Putin sees his regime as having no out, then the nuclear prospects go way up.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if we even, again, just put ourselves in the position of any country in possession of nuclear weapons, of which there are now 9, that any country in possession of nuclear weapons, if faced with an existential danger, truly the end of their regime itself, then that so far would be the one occasion in which most people predict that a country would actually go to those lengths. So far, again, mostly just out of good fortune, that nuclear powers have not been confronted with that sort of existential danger. But I'm saying that we may be approaching the point where that is the case in Russia.
Okay, but what you're saying, you're suggesting that the end of, say, Putin's presidency in his mind is the same as the end of Russia. Is that what you're saying? Because otherwise,
yes. I think that's right. I think as far as Vladimir Putin's concerned, that's true.
Okay, and you also are saying, just to confirm, that if he were to give an order to launch a nuclear strike in such circumstances, that order would be carried out.
Again, we've had instances, we don't know that. We've had instances in the past where false alarms were, again, thankfully, serendipitously, were not carried out when reports of, the belief that incoming missiles were in fact a flock of birds. We've had at various stages in the chain, not execute that order. But this is why this discussion is so critical at this moment. Because we are in the midst of a conflict involving a nuclear armed state that has the ability to use those weapons, we need to think through under what set of circumstances might they be used. And that's why, again, I go back to General Clark's supposition is sort of, is he, what is he saying in terms of when are those weapons most likely to be used? And if we're trying to prevent that from happening, then we should be identifying ways to avoid those precise situations that would increase the likelihood of the weapons being used, right?
No, I don't disagree with that point. Let me ask one more question. Putin's own statements give credibility to the idea that his ambitions go beyond Ukraine. He said in his speech a couple of weeks ago that he wants to essentially restore Moscow's influence among all the states that used to make up the Soviet Union. So the caution that you are suggesting with our support for Ukraine, would it also apply if Putin's designs then turn to our Baltic NATO allies?
I think that from the very beginning, President Biden has been clear that the commitment to NATO allies is sacrosanct. And so, no, I don't think that Vladimir Putin should operate under the same set of assumptions with respect to Ukraine as he would with respect to the Baltic states, for example, which are a NATO ally.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Oh, Wes, you want to jump in before I turn to Deborah?
Okay. I just a quick point.
Okay.
What we know of Russian strategic thinking is they believe that nuclear superiority is possible and it matters. In the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, KGB guys tell me that the reason Russia withdrew and Khrushchev pulled back was not because of the naval quarantine, not because Kennedy was such a great diplomat, but because the correlation of forces showed that we had strategic nuclear superiority. Putin believes right now that he has nuclear superiority with hypersonics and this drone torpedo that can go into New York Harbor and blow it up. And we gave up our coupling of our tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. They're not there except for maybe 100 air delivery things that you'd have to go through an SA-400 envelope. So he thinks he has some nuclear superiority. This is the danger. He also believes that Russia is better prepared to ride out a nuclear exchange than the United States.
Okay, thank you.
John, can I have a two-figure on that?
Please,
with respect to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's true that the United States had clear nuclear and conventional superiority over the Soviet Union in 1962. And yet in retrospect, it seems to me what's most remarkable about that incident was that the Kennedy administration was willing to make important concessions to Soviet demands in exchange for the removal of missiles from Cuba. That includes the removal of US missiles from Turkey and the pledge not to use force to overthrow the government in Cuba. Now, I don't think those were actually that great concessions. The weapons in Turkey were mostly strategically irrelevant, and attempts to overthrow the Castro government had already failed. So he was sort of doing us a favor. But I guess that the reason I bring this up is because what does nuclear superiority even mean? Does he believe that that Russia would survive a general nuclear exchange? I guess if he does believe that, then we should really be spending most of our time explaining to him in as many terms as possible, while that is absolutely not true. Right. I think maybe that's, if that's what you're saying, General Clark, then we really need to be communicating to him in as many different ways as possible, that would not be the case, that Russia would survive a general nuclear exchange. I think there's no reason to believe that. I don't think he has that kind of superiority, and in some respects, I don't think even nuclear superiority is a relevant, context as long as you have a secure second strike, which the United States has had arguably since 1959.
Okay, thank you. Deborah, I'll give you the final word before we turn to audience questions. Does the U.S. nuclear and conventional military capability give us the strength to provide Ukraine the support it needs to stop Putin's offensive? And what should that support be?
It does, but I'm going to, again, take a little bit different approach here. Some of the discussion just now reminds me very much of the type of, and I'm at the risk of showing my age, the discussions I had when I was a student of Albert Wallstedter's in the 70s at the University of Chicago. And some of this, and Morris Janowitz at the same time there. So some of this discussion reminds me of what South Africa was going to do with its nuclear weapons force. This is all very eerily similar. I'm just proud of myself in my dotage that I can remember those discussions. But I'm gonna go in a different direction. I'm glad someone here, and forgive me for forgetting, mentioned chemical weapons. I think this is an important point. Russian substrategic weapons are triple capable. So the Iskanders sitting in Kaliningrad also have chemical warheads, as well as nuclear and HE warheads. And I think Russia was not averse to helping Iran and Syria aerosolize the chemical weapons that were used in Syria. And I think the Russians have other calculations here, which is that last year when US soft forces were attacked in Al-Tanf, the Biden administration didn't say a word, not publicly or privately. So these are all calculations that go into how Putin decides to move forward. And I think that the likelihood of him using a smaller chemical attack is much higher than a nuclear one by about 500 times. And I think we have to look at that. But I also think that we've now turned into this hunkering down superpower. John, you used this phrase the other day. We are too a superpower. Let's start acting like it. We have a huge arsenal of weapons. We know how to defend ourselves and our allies, and we should stop pretending that we don't get it. And one other point to that is I don't see, and Wes will appreciate this, I don't see a plethora of rules of engagement here of what we're going to do when Russia hits accidentally, or as I like to say, accidentally on purpose, a target in Poland. So as they come closer to the western borders, the likelihood of that goes way up. I have been in long discussions with Croatian officials over the weekend about how this drone managed to sit over NATO airspace of two countries and no warning was issued. So Putin sees that as another NATO failure in terms of air defense, alertness. And these are all things that he can exploit. So I would like to see, in addition to what we're talking about in terms of the United States actually acting like the superpower it is supposed to be, I would also like to see NATO and others more publicly talk about what these rules of engagement are going to be, or are we just going to sit on our hands when that first missile strikes a migrant population center in Poland?
Okay, thank you. All right, let's turn to audience questions. And I think, Deborah, the first one will be for you. It's from George Groman. He says, Munich in the run-up to World War II was a disaster. Going forward with General Clark's and Mr. Lodal's conference, may I ask, what are we waiting for? Meaning, I think, about providing more support for Ukraine.
Thank you. Excellent question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know why the White House is slow rolling the MiG-29s. I think they tried to blame it on Poland, and then Poland called their bluff. I don't know why we're slow rolling coastal defense. I don't know why we're slow rolling providing them more accurate counter jamming capabilities from either the whole suite of EW that we have. And none of that would have to fly over Ukraine. This is the 21st century. You could be standoff and still provide that data. And I frankly don't know, despite Jen Psaki's oft-repeated comments that we're giving them targeting data, why are we not giving them data from AWACS and JSTARS, which would allow them to vector their targets and see the whole battle space as opposed to just the battlefield?
You're talking military jargon. Please explain to our audience JSTARS, AWACS, and vectoring.
So JSTARS and AWACS could fly easily over any NATO airspace and then provide data that would allow Ukrainian forces to get a better battle space picture of air, ground, naval integrated, see what's going on, and then make command and control decisions to target those Russian targets. And the first part of this, the electronic warning system, would allow us and NATO countries to help Ukraine in jamming the jammers. So The Russians have two huge, really huge ground-based jammers sitting on the ground in Belarus, and they're also flying the version of AWACS. And all of that is disrupting Ukrainian command and control and their ability to instruct and do the strategic lines of communication it needs with its forces. These are simple things that we can do that do not involve us flying over Ukraine, and yet we have stonewalled them on this.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Jack Krupansky, and we'll give this to Wes. Do low-yield battlefield tactical nuclear weapons have an alert level, or can they be used without warning, in contrast to strategic and higher-yield tactical nuclear weapons? General, over to you.
They probably do have an alert level. We may or may not be able to detect that. It's probably not given in the same channels as the strategic alert systems. And it probably goes down through Russian command channels. Whether we can monitor the distinctive metadata that indicates it's a nuclear alert, whether we've broken those command channels or not, I don't know. I suspect we haven't and can't, but there may be some signatures of nuclear weapons taken from storage that we could get through overhead imagery or something. I just wouldn't count on any great warning that he's about to fire a nuclear artillery round. But I do want to say this about the tactical weapons. We failed to advance enhanced radiation warheads. The Russians developed enhanced radiation warheads and they downsized them, and that's what they have. So their nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, would actually be very useful on a battlefield, whereas our equivalent is going to blow down buildings and trees. Theirs actually kills people.
Okay. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I agree with the general in terms of an alert. I just wanted to underscore the importance of Russia's non-strategic nuclear weapons for these scenarios for people who aren't experts. So we think Russia has about 2,000 of these non-strategic nuclear weapons, some with a sub-kiloton yield. So, Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. So some of these less than a kiloton. And they have nuclear torpedoes, nuclear depth charges, nuclear mines, nuclear surface-to-air missiles to go after airplanes, nuclear-armed missile defense interceptors to go after incoming missiles, short-range missiles. So they have a wide variety of these battlefield nuclear weapons that they could use in Ukraine. And that's part of the reason that the threat is real and that I think Putin would find this as potentially an attractive option.
Just in one sentence, John, that's why I was suggesting that we do what we can to make the few that we do have more visible and out there so that they don't think this is a complete unilateral advantage. It's an advantage no matter what, but the more we can do to minimize that would help.
All right. Jan, do you want to jump in on this, or Chris?
Well, Jan already responded. I guess the question is, it gets back to my earlier point about what does Vladimir Putin believe are the pathways to escalation? Because based on this discussion over the use of tactical nuclear weapons, as Jan points out, the United States has some, and Matt pointed out what the Russian capabilities are. The question is, how confident is Vladimir Putin that the use of a tactical nuclear weapon won't result in the United States and NATO widening the war against him? I guess I don't know why he would have that confidence. In fact, I think, if anything, he would expect a disproportionate response to the use of even a single tactical nuclear weapon in this theater.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Jack Krupansky, which actually ties into what we've just been discussing. Does the U.S. have a clear doctrine as to what our options are in the face of Russian use of battlefield tactical nukes? Must we respond in kind with nuclear response, or maybe limit to a strictly conventional military response, or pursue the nuclear aspect via intensive diplomacy? Matt, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Of course, it would come up to the decision of the commander-in-chief, and so Biden would make the ultimate decision on possible use of nuclear weapons. I would say that since 2014, there's been a lot of thinking about what we would do if Russia use this escalate to de-escalate strategy and use nuclear weapons against a NATO ally. Say there's an attack on the Baltic states that escalates, what would we do? It's up to the decision of the president, but what many defense experts, including me, would argue is that our threat should be limited retaliation. You use one or two, we'll use 1, 2, or 3 back. Otherwise we're faced with this suicide or just surrender point. Suicide, we get into a massive nuclear exchange. Surrender, we back down and let Putin do whatever he wants. So I think most defense strategists think some kind of limited response is the right one. What complicates this is it's in Ukraine. It's not in a NATO ally. And Biden said he's not going to get involved militarily. Presumably, he meant that to apply even if Putin uses nuclear weapons. So I think that complicates it. My prediction is that if this happened, the Biden administration would fight through without retaliating with nuclear weapons of its own. Continue doing what it was doing, supplying the Ukrainians, sanctions, etc.
Matt, just to confirm that, I see, Chris, you have a 2-finger. I'll come to you next. You're suggesting that if they did use a tactical nuke in Ukraine, the Biden administration would simply maintain its current course. It would not provide additional assistance to Ukraine. That's your sense how this would play out?
Well, I think it might. I think it would. My prediction is it would stay on the same basic course of sanctions, providing assistance to the Ukrainians, reinforcing eastern flank of NATO. So maybe it would dial up each of those areas, but my sense is that Biden would still want to avoid making this a direct U.S.-Russia war. Okay, fair enough. Chris?
Yeah, I think, again, it's completely understandable. We've seen the horrific images from Ukraine. People are being killed by Russian weapons. We are thinking of this in military terms, but I think we need to step back a little bit and recognize that there are many, many options for the United States and our NATO allies to respond beyond the military. So, for example, Matt said that the United States, that the U.S. position is the United States is not militarily involved in Ukraine. Well, the United States is militarily involved in Ukraine. We are providing military assistance to the Ukrainians at a critical moment, which seems to be having an effect. But Deborah's point was, why are we not acting like a superpower? Why are we not going further? Well, I guess I'd put it back to Deborah. Deborah, you said that the United States could operate surveillance aircraft that would cover Ukraine, but be operating over NATO territory. Correct me if I've gotten this wrong. Well, why not fly over Ukraine if that's the point? I mean, in other words, all of us are dancing around the question of whether any limits at all are appropriate and under what set of circumstance. And my argument is that some military limits are appropriate in light of the risks of escalation, but that there are many other tools available to the United States. In terms of escalation, the United States has leaned on some countries that have not participated in the broad-based sanctions and other economic punishments against the Russians, but there are still other instruments other levers to pull. The United States, of course, President Biden led on this. So the United States is not going to purchase Russian oil or natural gas. It's a small part of the U.S. consumption anyway, but European or Asian allies could also go that additional step. It would be much more painful to them, but it'd also be much more painful to Russia. So I think we just have to be clear that the United States is a superpower, and we have very powerful allies. Our power does not reside exclusively in our ability to respond to Russian aggression purely through military means. I just emphasize to everyone that we need to be thinking clearly about the range of tools that the United States is using and could still use and even escalate beyond the military instrument.
Debra, might you want to respond to that?
I really do. Wes, do you want to hop in here before I go nuclear in my own way?
I want to say I agree with what Chris says. There are many other things we should have done, and we should have done them earlier. Things like demanding the UN put in a safe zone and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, U.S. power rests on not just on its economy, but on its strategic nuclear power. And what Putin believes he's found, and what the rest of the world is seeing, is a hole in the U.S. concept of extended deterrence. We're happy to clobber Muammar Gaddafi when he threatens 10,000 people in eastern Libya. But we're willing to stand back while a nation of 44 million is subjugated brutally. This is, if this occurs, we'll lose the moral authority that we've had. And we're already seeing it as the number of nations in the United Nations who won't support the UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia. They think Putin's right, that we're weak and we've lost the power. What General Haig, my old boss, used to call the ultimate arbiter, which was our strategic nuclear strength. Thank you, Deborah.
John?
And as we have studied for years, the more we allow ourselves to lose the conventional battle, the higher the risk is that the whole thing blows up in our face. And as Wes says, it all comes back to that. If we want to reduce the risk of the nuclear stuff, get them the support they need now. The stuff Deborah suggested, the other stuff, John, you and I have discussed about and so forth. Get them that stuff now. May not be enough, but that's our best way to reduce the nuclear risk.
Okay, Deborah, you want to finish this?
Sure. Okay, so I want to say that I have no problem overflying Ukraine. I'm not the Biden administration. I also encouraged the Biden administration back in January to cut off the Russian oil and do things on the energy thing, and the answer was no. So we may have a range of options, but the fact that we are dripping these out like some horrible water torture, and to see, well, how high does the body count in Ukraine have to go before we actually do what we should be doing? And that's the problem I have. And Wes knows this well. We spent way too long before we decided to go after the Serbs because of what they were doing to the Bosnians. And we finally made the decision. And the Russians had 98th Guard airborne troops on the ground in Serbia at the time, and somehow World War III did not erupt. And I would argue that if I hear anyone in this administration or on the Hill or in the media say World War III one more time, I'm going to scream. And the fact that I live alone, so I do scream quite often, just no one hears me. So the point is, we are constraining ourselves. We have tied our collective hands behind our backs to do a whole host of things that we could be doing that would not enrage the Russians to the point where World War III would break out or that they would use nuclear weapons. And this is self-constrained. It's like we're preempting ourselves to behave like a superpower and use our entire range of options, Christopher, that you suggested, because we have this quivering fear that if we do this, Vlad, who is crazy and unpredictable, might do something really awful in return. I would argue that this whole crazy and unpredictable argument is also a Russian narrative that we've bought into. And so my bottom line is there are tons more things we can do as a superpower that will not start World War III, that will not start some sort of conflict that the White House keeps talking about. And indeed, Jan and Wes know darn well what I'm talking about. The number of times we have had a confrontation with the Soviet Union and then Russia that did not result in World War III and barely resulted in a whisper are too numerous to count. So suggesting that all of a sudden this dynamic is somehow different strikes me as just being both historically and now in current terms just wrong. And I have to say one other thing, John, I'm sorry, but the cynic in me argues that there are people in this administration and in other Western countries who just wish Ukraine would go quietly into the night so they could go back to doing business with Russia on their silly arms control agreements that never get completely implemented because the Russians cheat, on energy issues and everything else. And I think, I'm sorry about that, but I believe that this is all part of the equation.
Okay, thank you. Wes, you wanted to add something about the political dimension here and how that affects our policy?
I know we're almost out of time, John, but we haven't really talked about the politics of this. And to me, the politics of this are really important. No one in America wants to confront the idea of a nuclear effort. I mean, it's just shocking. It's horrible. And you can imagine that it would mean immediately Biden would go to 0% in the polls if he said, well, we have to face the risk of a nuclear. Let's do what we need to do anyway. He couldn't do it. But here's what is happening. Opinion is moving in the direction of taking greater risks. And it's really the politics of this rather than the science of the strategy, which is likely to drive the American response, in my view. And the closer you get to the Russian threat, the greater the politics favor taking risk, I submit. That's why this Polish deputy prime minister and his team going into Ukraine is so important. They will come back and provide the eyewitness testimony and galvanize the Europeans. I remember the 1990s when the United States wouldn't get involved in the Balkans. We finally did. We're slow. We're a long way away. So it's the politics you have to look at on this. And if Biden doesn't take a more proactive, if Ukraine falls, if he stands back, he's not going to be able to say in the midterms or in the 2024 election, well, okay, I did lose Ukraine, but at least I prevented a nuclear war. This idea that somehow what we can do will prevent Putin from doing what he wants to do is nonsense.
Okay.
And we've got to be really careful about how the politics of it play out. Thanks,
Wes,
John.
thank you for that. And I think those who left the discussion will be disappointed that they missed that. But Chris, I suspect you have something you'd like to say on the subject.
Well, I just maybe Wes is looking at different polls than I am, but I have not seen evidence that the American people wish to substantially increase the U.S. direct role in this war. Again, I want to be very clear. The United States is providing considerable military assistance to Ukraine, which seems to be having an effect on the battlefield. You need to acknowledge that. I have seen no evidence that President Biden and his key advisors have misread public sentiment here in the United States that is calling for a significant increase in U.S. involvement militarily in this war. Now, again, Wes, if you have access to other polling, please share it. But what I have seen is that there is strong public support, stronger than I would have expected, to be clear. So there is strong public support for the measures that the Biden administration has taken so far, and yet still strong opposition to U.S. military personnel becoming directly involved in this conflict, either on the ground or in the air. I've seen no evidence to suggest the American people are supportive of that escalation on the part of the United States.
Okay, let's move to. We have a couple other questions. We have a bunch of questions. We only got 2 minutes left. One is from Howard Teicher. One of Putin's strategic goals: divide Europe from the U.S. and reinforce decoupling. How would European nuclear powers respond to Russia's limited use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Matt, do you have any ideas on that question?
I think I missed a key word there. How would European powers, nuclear?
Right. European nuclear powers, we're talking about France and Britain here, but maybe Europe more broadly, respond in your judgment to a tactical nuke use by Putin in Ukraine?
Yes. Well, I think this is another reason why the escalate to de-escalate strategy seems attractive to Putin. If there's something of a nuclear allergy in Washington, I think it's even stronger in Europe. And so I think these nuclear threats are meant to try to divide the alliance, divide ministries of defense from their populations. But if he actually used a nuclear weapon, it's really hard to know how that would go. I think there'd also be a lot of moral outrage in Europe and the rest of the world at the first use of nuclear weapons since 1945. So it may actually galvanize a tougher Western response, as we've seen over the past few weeks. I find it unlikely that Britain or France would respond with nuclear weapons if the United States was unwilling to do that, if that's what the question is asking. But we have seen the French go on nuclear alert in response to the Russian alert, which so they have been more forward-leaning on that front.
Well, they know how to behave as a superpower, even if they're not quite in that category, I suppose. Okay, last question from Jean Mayer. Could the U.S. launch cyber attacks on nuclear operations or communications? Let's see. Wes, you want to try that?
I was so busy answering Chris, I didn't on the chat. I didn't say again the question.
Okay. Could the U.S. launch cyber attacks on nuclear operations or communications?
Certainly. And we may already be doing that for all I know. But, we just can't speculate on that. And remember, the country most vulnerable to cyber attack is who? The United States, and especially our electricity grid. And so if the electricity grid in the United States is attacked, there'll be pandemonium. Putin knows this. He knows what the vulnerability is, and most people believe he's got malware embedded in it. So when you look for these hybrid forms of warfare, I'm sure we're doing what we think we can do, but I think there, just as in what you're seeing in the visible action, there's a level at which we don't want to take a risk beyond for fear of what the response might be from Russia.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for participating, for a wonderful and a lively discussion, and for tuning in. And we'll be doing more on Moscow's war in Ukraine next week. So thank you all.